Summary number 6. So, brethren, today's topic is we're going to treat with when the 7-day Sabbath sign first given to any man as an ordinance to be kept. So, brethren, it's a pleasure being here once again this evening. And all scriptures will be read from the King James Version Bible. And today's segment, it's not long, but it's a medium length. All right, so I'll start, brethren. We are often told by our zealous Sabbath keeping friends, all sects, that the seventh-day Sabbath was first given to man as an ordinance to be kept in the Garden of Eden. This heresy they attempt to justify by citing the biblical reference of Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, which states, God, not Adam, ended his work on the seventh day and rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Brethren, just give me 1 second, please. I'm seeing that I need. Okay. All right, so my apologies. So I'll continue. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. This text is falsely reinterpreted to mean that God instructed man to keep the Sabbath when such was not the intent nor the event. Brethren, I am asking a question now. Can any honest-minded individual claim that the Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 text represents the giving of the Sabbath ordinance to man? I repeat, can any honest-minded individual claim that Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 text represents the giving of the Sabbath ordinance to man? And the answer to that question is never, for it does not. Now, one could not honestly arrive at such a conclusion. On the other hand, it must be clear to all sincere seekers of the truth that that text is a declaration of what God did and a result of the culmination of his creative accomplishments on the seventh day. This being so, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 can never be interpreted to be an instruction given to man. Instead, that Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 text must be seen for what it is, even as information given to man, informing us of what God himself did, rather than what he instructed or expected us to do. Brethren and online listeners, the fact that Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 was not an instruction given to man is further established once one considers the fact that more than 2,500 years elapsed before any reference was made again of the seventh day. This is indeed significant, especially when one considers the fact that Enoch, the first man who was translated, a man whom the Bible described as one that walked with God, never kept nor preached about the Sabbath. Read Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 to 24, and Jude chapter 1, verses 14 to 15, if you are in doubt of what I'm stating here today. Moreover, brethren, Noah, a preacher of righteousness, whose family alone escaped the global judgment of his day, never once mentioned the Sabbath day, although he preached for some 100 years. Or shall we consider Job, a perfect man, according to God's estimation. Job chapter 1, verses 1 and 8, being totally silent on the Sabbath question, although the book of Job deals comprehensively with the religious manners and customs of his day. Brethren, the truth of the matter is this. The Seventh-day Sabbath commandment was never given to Adam and Eve as an ordinance to be kept in the Garden of Eden. Neither was it given to any man as an ordinance to be kept until it was first given to the children of Israel after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. Read Exodus chapter 16, verses 23 to 29, as it clearly states. Now, the fact that the Sabbath was not given to any man as an ordinance to be kept before it was first given to the children of Israel after they left Egypt is clearly established by Moses' declaration that preambles the said covenant that contains the Sabbath commandments. So the following quotes accordingly highlights. So I'm reading Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 2 to 3. It says, the Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb, that's Mount Sinai. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, therefore Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. So that's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 2 to 3. Now, that stated declaration, brethren, and online listeners, clearly states that the covenant which God made with the children of Israel in Horeb, that's Mount Sinai, which covenant is clearly detailed in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 to 21, and referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9 and 11, Exodus chapter 34, verses 27 to 28, or 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 9 and 21. Even the Ten Commandments was not made with Israel's forefathers. That is, with Abraham, Isaac, nor Jacob, but with the company of mainly Israelites, which Moses led out of Egyptian bondage. This fact, I repeat, is plainly stated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, my dear brethren and online listeners. So without a doubt, this Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 text provides us with undeniable biblical evidence that the Seventh-day Sabbath, and indeed the first covenant, even the Ten Commandments, were not given to Abraham, Isaac, nor Jacob, according to Moses' testimony, which is recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, and verses 5 to 22. Because of this biblical facts, we know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that neither the Seventh-day Sabbath nor the Ten Commandments was ever given to any man as ordinances to be kept before they were given to the children of Israel after they left Egypt under Moses' leadership and dwelt in the wilderness of Sin and Sinai. Brethren, I would like you to read Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 29, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, and verses 6 to 21, carefully, and be convinced that this is very useful. Brethren, let us now consider the testimony of another writer in the Bible to see whether Moses made a mistake with respect to the time when the Sabbath was first given to man as an ordinance to be kept. For this exercise, therefore, I would like you, brethren, to turn your Bibles to Nehemiah, a Jewish reformer who recounts the history of the children of Israel from the period of their forefather Abraham's departure from Ur of the Chaldeans to their sojourn in the land of Canaan. Now notice, if you will, that Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 11 records Israel's departure from Egypt, while verse 12 summarizes their sojourn in the wilderness, where God gave them the first covenants, even the Ten Commandments, of which the Sabbath commandment is an integral part. Now, what is significant in Nehemiah's record is the fact that he states that it was in the wilderness of Sinai God made his Sabbath known to the children of Israel. The following quotes surely highlights this historical and doctrinal fact. Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 13 to 14, which says, Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and speakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments, and true laws, good statutes, and commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws, by the hand of Moses thy servants. That's Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 13 to 14. Now, my dear brethren and online listener, please note that the word of God makes it abundantly clear that it was in the wilderness of Sinai and not in the Garden of Eden that God made known his holy Sabbath to any man as an ordinance to be kept. So from that, brethren, therefore, it is evident that the Jewish reformer, Nehemiah, agrees with Moses' evidence of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. That the first covenant, of which the Sabbath is an integral part, was given to the Israelites only after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. That's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 and verses 5 to 22. And was not given to Israel's forefather, Abraham, Isaac, nor Jacob, for that matter. This Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 13 to 14 text proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Sabbath was not given to anyone as an ordinance to be kept before it was first given to the Israelites under Moses' leadership after they left Egypt. On this point, Moses and Nehemiah surely agree. Moreover, on this said topic under review, there's another writer of the Hebrew Bible who supports the fact that the Sabbath was not given to any man as an ordinance to be kept before it was first given to the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. In this regard, the book of Ezekiel is instructive indeed. For in chapter 20, verse 8, we found a brief history of Israel's sojourn in the land of Egypt. Then, brethren, if you would notice, in verse 9, it indicates that God took the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. Now, verses 10 to 11 states, inform us that God brought the children of Israel in the wilderness unto himself, where he gave them his statutes and judgment, even his laws. Now, because God knew of the problems which his church would have had with regard to the Sabbath question, he took special care to inform us concerning the time when the Sabbath was first given. Accordingly, verse 12 emphatically states, Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctified them. So that's Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12. Now, where did the giving of the Sabbaths of Jehovah take place? Inquiring friends, according to the information God gave to Ezekiel, the Sabbaths, meaning the Seventh-day Sabbath including, were given to the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. That's Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 8 to 12. Therefore, brethren and Sabbath-keeping friends, after careful consideration of the testimonies of Moses, Nehemiah, and Ezekiel, we must conclude that the Seventh-day Sabbath was never given to any man as an ordinance to be kept before it was first given to the children of Israel after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. It was never given before, as our Sabbath-keeping friends believe and teach. This fact, I repeat, finds biblical support in the following texts. So, on your own time, brethren, I would like you to read Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, verses 5 to 22, Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 7 to 14, and Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 7 to 12, and verse 20, my dear online listeners. To be sure, brethren and Sabbath enthusiasts, there is not one single biblical text which can be cited to contradict those stated positions, not even a reference of Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. For that text was not an instruction given to man. Instead, it should be seen for what it really is, even as information given to man, informing us of what God himself did and intends to do in commemoration of the culmination of his work at the end of creation, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Now, because God knew that the children of Israel would not have accepted Jesus Christ, the giver of the true rest of hope, he gave them the Sabbath covenant as a sign to keep alive their hope of the true rest, which Christ alone can give. Because of this fact, he inspired Moses to write the following reminder. So, I'm reading from Exodus chapter 31, verse 14, verses 16 to 17. You shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So that's Exodus chapter 31, verses 14, and then verses 16 to 17. So that scripture, brethren and online listeners, leaves no doubts whatever that the 7-day Sabbath is but an everlasting covenantal sign between God and the children of Egypt. And the children of Israel. I repeat, that the 7-day Sabbath is but an everlasting covenantal sign between God and the children of Israel. And because it was God's divine intention to use the 7-day Sabbath as well as all the other Sabbaths as a covenantal sign, as Exodus chapter 31, verse 13 states, between himself and his earthly bride, Israel, as in Isaiah chapter 54, verses 48. No mention was ever made of the seventh day for more than 2,000 years, from the day that it was first mentioned as the day on which God himself, not Adam nor Eve, rested in commemoration of his creative accomplishments, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, until it was given to the children of Israel after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. This fact, Exodus chapter 16, verses 23 to 29, surely supports, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 2 to 3 and verses 6 to 22 concludes. This more than 2,000 years, 7 days silence from Adam's creation until the children of Israel left Egypt takes on even greater significance when one considers the fact that neither Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, nor Jacob was a Sabbath keeper. This fact is put beyond question once one looks at Galatians chapter 3, verse 17, which states unambiguously that the law was instituted some 430 years after God's covenantal promise was made to Abraham, and so could not negate any benefit of that original promise, which was previously made by him. This position finds textual ventilation in Moses' writings, for Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 states emphatically that the first covenant, even the 10 commandments, recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 6 to 21, was not made with Israel's forefathers, namely Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8, but with Moses and those who came out of Egyptian bondage with him. This fact should end all arguments concerning the time in which the Sabbath was first given to man as an ordinance to be kept, but it has not, despite the ordinance of available evidence which we have in support of restated position. Sabbath enthusiast, you would no doubt reason, if the Sabbath was not given to any man as an ordinance to be kept, before it was first given to the children of Israel after they left Egypt, which was some 430 years after Abraham, as Galatians chapter 3, verse 17 states, compared with Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 and verses 4 to 21. How could God have said in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? My dear Sabbath keeping friends, all six, the answer to this question follows. Now, the reason for the remember in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, can be traced to the fact that God had previously given Israel the Sabbath sign a few weeks before he told them Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This fact can be verified by reading Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 22, which lets us know that God first introduced the Sabbath ordinance to the children of Israel in the second month after they were departed out of the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 5 and verses 23 to 29. On the other hand, he gave them the 10 commandments after the third month, following their departure from Egypt, because of this time sequence, and in fact that it was broken was very weak. It was first given. The word remember in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 is perfectly in order. So proof of what I just mentioned and those time sequence can be gleaned by comparing Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 2, verses 23 to 29, with Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 to 5, and Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 20. So the following highlights, and brethren, I would like you to read those scriptures on your own time. And he said unto them, this is that which the Lord had said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seek that which ye will seek, and that which remaineth overlay up for you to be kept until the morning. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. That's Exodus chapter 16, 23 to 25. Then a few weeks later, when the 10 commandments were given, God reminded Israel of the Sabbath commandments in the following words. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That's Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Now I know you would no doubt conclude that the explanation adequately answers the remember issue. But you may quite rightly reason that it does not address the other concern in the passage. That of the linkage between the remember of Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, and the seventh-day reference of Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, in which it is stated that God ended his work on the seventh day and rested from all his work also. Read Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, and Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 on your own time, brethren. Well, if that poses any problems for you, there is no need for it to continue if you would but read the following carefully. End time saints and Sabbath keeping friends. In order to understand the relationship between Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 and verse 11, and Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, it would be helpful indeed if you reread key facts or if you listen to my segments, right? When I started, you're going to do from proof number 1 to proof number 4. And I would like you to read. I think I need to go back a little. I would like you to go back to when I had done some segments, because that will be the better segments to listen to. So I have done some segments where I explained the Sabbath, right? And I will prefer you to go back to those segments and start from the first segment on explaining the Sabbath onto the fourth segment, right? So the first segment to the fourth segment on explaining the Sabbath, and you would be able to understand what is it that I'm saying here, because I have to introduce Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, and Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 to 18. The reason being is because it will be unfolding one of the mysteries of the Bible. For in those passages are locked up certain aspects of creation, which were only summarized in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, respectively. Accordingly, excerpts of the Isaiah text follow. So I'm reading Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 14 now, and it says, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like that. I will be like the Most High. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 14. End time saints, when one compares the evidence of Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15, or Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 to 18, with the creation story recorded in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, and Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, one can easily understand the following. And that this Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 to 14 incident predates the creation of Adam. That angelic beings, meaning Satan included, were created long before Adam. For Job chapter 38, verse 7 states, When the cornerstone of the earth was laid, the sons of God, meaning angels, shouted for joy. So I would like you to read Job chapter 1, verse 6 for the identity of the sons of God of Job chapter 38, verse 7. Now, if Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 does not represent an earlier creation, then I must conclude that Satan and Adam are playmates, and that can never be true when one considers that angelic beings were created long before Adam. Now, that long before Adam was created, Satan had a throne, which was located somewhere beneath the stars and beneath the clouds. Read Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 to 14. That stated location of Satan's throne meant that it was situated beneath God's throne. Lucifer was not satisfied with the location of his throne being beneath God's throne. Therefore, he instigated a coup in the heaven in an attempt to unseat God from his exalted position in pursuing sin, and he failed miserably. He nevertheless succeeded in turning the earth of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 into a state of being without form and void. Read Genesis chapter 1, verse 7. As a consequence of Lucifer not being satisfied with the location of his throne being beneath God's throne, and succeeded in turning the earth into a state of being without form and void, the creative operations of Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 to 31, became a necessity. God himself, not Adam or Eve, rested on the seventh day after having completed his work on the seventh day. Read Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. This he did to celebrate his creative ability over Satan's destructive adventure, recorded in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Now, since Adam and Eve knew nothing about that incident of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, since that took place before their day, they were never given the Sabbath as an ordinance to be kept. For the Sabbath sign either commemorates a deliverance from same personal past bondage or foreshadows some future rest. Read Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Now, Adam and Eve, who were created and placed in their inheritance, enjoyed rest in the very presence of God. The children of Israel, on the other hand, were held in bondage in Egypt, and so were in dire need of deliverance and subsequent rest or Sabbath. Now we will recall that God himself rested on the seventh day, After he had successfully delivered the earth of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, from Satan's bondage of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. In like manner, after he had successfully delivered the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, he gave them the Sabbath commandments to commemorate their deliverance from Pharaoh's bondage. That's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. By this Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15 text, therefore, the rest or Sabbath linkage between Israel's deliverance and the deliverance of the earth of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, from its former chaotic state, as described in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, is surely established. Brethren and Sabbath keeping friends, I repeat, the parallel between these two deliverances are undoubtedly established. For just as God rested on the seventh day to commemorate the deliverance of the earth of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, from Satan's bondage recorded in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, even so, the children of Israel were instructed by God to rest on the seventh day in commemoration of the deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, compared with Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 2. Pharaoh being a type of Satan. This, brethren and Sabbath keeping friends, explains the scriptural linkage between Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, and Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, as was previously promised. From those paragraphs, therefore, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the 7-day Sabbath was not given to anyone as an ordinance to be kept in the Garden of Eden. Instead, it was first given in the second month after the children of Israel were delivered from Egyptian bondage, as Exodus chapter 16, verses 23 to 29 states. Then a few weeks later, when God included a Sabbath ordinance in the Ten Commandments, he told the children of Israel to remember to keep it holy. Now, since he had previously commanded them to keep the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 16, verses 23 to 29, at which time it was broken on the very next day after which it was given, as Exodus chapter 16, verse 23, 25, 27 to 28 states, the remember of Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 is surely justified. End time saints and inquiring listeners, I know that what was just said is true. For Moses, Nehemiah, Ezekiel, and Paul, whose writings were inspired by God, all supports this stated position that I've brought forward today on this segment. Sabbath enthusiasts, I am asking you the question, on whose side are you? Sabbath keeping friends, if the pursuit of truth in your sincere desire, let God be true and every man a liar. Read Romans chapter 3, verse 4. For the Bible makes it abundantly clear that the 7-day Sabbath was not given to the children of Israel nor to anyone else as an ordinance to be kept before it was first given to the children of Israel some 2,500 years after Adam's creation. My conclusion finds textual support from the fact that Abraham was born after the flood, which occurred some 2,000 years after Adam was created. And from Galatians chapter 3, verse 17, we know that the law, even the Ten Commandments, was given 430 years after Abraham, and therefore could not have been given to him. This fact was before confirmed in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 1 to 3, a passage which states emphatically that the first covenant, even the Ten Commandments, of which the Sabbath is an integral part, was not made with Israel's forefathers. That is, Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Read Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8. But with those Israelites who came out of Egyptian bondage under the leadership of Moses. Read Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 and verses 6 to 22. So as I come to a close, brethren, my conclusion, brethren and Sabbath keeping friends, are God ordained facts recorded for us in the Bible and no vision, no views of anyone else can ever change them. For the Sabbath, as an ordinance to be kept, was never given to any man before it was first given to the children of Israel, after they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. For Exodus chapter 16, verse 1 to 23, and verse 25 to 29. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, verses 6 to 21. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 7 to 14. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 6 to 12, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 17. Surely confirm these facts, and no one can justifiably refute it. So, brethren, that's the end of my segment today. I will be live next week again, brethren, and I'm asking you, brethren, to please prepare yourselves for Jesus Christ's return. His return is sooner than you think. The prophecies are slowly being manifested on earth. So, brethren, have a safe and productive week. Remember that Jesus Christ loves you and I love you. So, bye for now.